Imagine walking into your local Walmart, Costco, or Kroger, grabbing your favorite deli meats, turkey bacon, or even a quick chicken Alfredo meal, only to find out weeks later that those very products were part of a massive recall. Across 45 states, contaminated meats from Boar's Head, Oscar Mayer, Bruce Pack, Fresh Realm, Bourgeois, and Olancho have been linked to listeria, unsanitary factory conditions, and even fake USDA inspection stamps. Families who thought they were buying safe food are now facing hospital visits, recalls, and fear. What's hiding behind those labels is far more dangerous than you think. Let's start. Part 1. The Recall Map: How a Hidden Pathogen Went National. However, scale without context is a mirage, so let us set the stakes with the cold edge of a date and a comparison to anchor the mind. On the other hand, public health investigators now describe the deli meat listeriosis emergency as the largest crisis of its kind since 2011, and the number of states involved is the kind of sprawl only a modern supply chain can engineer. Meanwhile, hospitalizations cluster around the most vulnerable, and outcomes reflect unequal defenses inside the human body. Even so, the story is not fear, it is mechanics. Cold case, hot risk. However, to understand the mechanics, you need the villain's name and the villain's methods, and that name is Listeria monocytogenes, and its methods are patience and cold endurance. On the other hand, unlike many bacteria that hate the fridge, this one survives and sometimes thrives at temperatures that lull the rest of us into complacency. Meanwhile, the groups most at risk are not a mystery, because pregnant women, older adults, and people with weakened immunity pay the highest price when exposure turns into invasion. But the most surprising thing is how ordinary foods become perfect vehicles. Ready to eat can mean ready to infect. By the way, you'll never know what's really hidden in your plate at chains like these. Subscribe now and protect yourself before your next bite. However, we are conditioned to trust the freezer and the deli case as safe harbors, yet the difference between raw meat that you cook and ready slices you do not is a killing step you never perform. On the other hand, when contamination lives on slicers, drains, or chillers, every pass across the blade is a distribution event disguised as convenience. Meanwhile, the long refrigerated shelf life of deli meats stretches the window for exposure far beyond a single weekend. Even so, the cold glow of the case hides warm realities of risk. Cold case, hot risk. However, there is a language that tells you when the system itself has raised its loudest alarm, and that language is a Class 1 recall. On the other hand, Class I means there is a reasonable probability of severe health consequences or death if the product is eaten, which is the regulatory way to say do not negotiate. Meanwhile, there are no heroic salvage hacks for Class 1, no rinsing ritual, no microwave myth worth clinging to when the stakes are this high. Even so, the instruction remains disarmingly simple for something so grave. Discard now means discard now. However, the most useful power for a shopper is not panic, it is literacy. And recall literacy begins with the invisible grammar stamped on every package you touch. On the other hand, the tiny block of characters beside the brand carries the establishment number, the lot code, and the use by window that link your dinner to a factory line. Meanwhile, that string can decide whether you keep or toss, whether you cook or call, whether you shrug or sanitize, and that decision must become a habit rather than a hunch. But the most surprising thing is how small the truth appears. The code decides. However, numbers only matter when tied to names you recognize at a glance. So here is the arc we will follow across the next chapters with facts that do not blink. On the other hand, Boar's Head anchors the scale shock with millions of pounds recalled and a death toll that turns statistics into families, while Bruce Pack exposes the institutional pipeline that feeds schools and hospitals at industrial speed. Meanwhile, Oscar Mayer turkey bacon proves the breakfast trap of familiar labels, and Fresh Realms chicken, Alfredo shows how meal kits can smuggle risk behind a fresh facade. Even so, two edge cases sharpen the lesson. Different brands, same weak points. However, the path from concern to control is short and practical, and it begins in your refrigerator before it reaches your feed. On the other hand, if you or someone you love is pregnant, over 65, or immunocompromised, the safest play with recalled deli meats is heat and caution, because a surface kill at 165 degrees turns risk into steam. Meanwhile, anything that touched the suspect package deserves a bleach wipe or a hot wash from the shelf groove to the cutting board, because invisible residue is how outbreaks linger. Even so, your cleanup is not paranoia, it is hygiene with purpose. Today's fridge check beats tomorrow's ER. However, brand names can be masks as much as reputations, because the factory that made the product may not match the logo that that sold it to you. On the other hand, co-packing means one plant fills many labels, which is why a recall can suddenly jump from a national brand to a private label 30 feet away on the same aisle. Meanwhile, if you remember our deep dive into Aldi, you remember the point that the cheapest sticker does not reveal the deepest origin, and the only way to know is to trace the establishment mark itself. Even so, the habit is straightforward and repeatable. One plant, many labels. However, maps and labels are only half the story, because the real answers live inside the plants, where scale becomes motion, and motion becomes shortcuts. On the other hand, the name Jarrett in Virginia now sits on the timeline like a pivot, and what follows is not rumor, but inspection, remediation, and a forced reckoning with what was missed. Meanwhile, the next chapter will step through those doors and measure the gap between what should happen and what did, from sanitation logs to leadership changes to the raw truth of volume. Even so, the open question remains, and it demands a closer look. What failed behind the stainless steel, says Part 2. Inside the Plants, Boar's Head and the Institutional Pipeline. However, doors that once opened to the perfume of smoked ham now open to a different kind of air, a mix of sanitizer and paperwork that tells you a factory has been humbled by its own momentum. On the other hand, Jarrett, Virginia is no longer a dot on a shipping ledger, but the pivot where millions of pounds of deli meats were traced, questioned, and recalled. Meanwhile, the number is not vague, because roughly 7 million pounds moved from shelves to dumpsters by order, not rumor. Even so, scale without change is negligence. Scale became the blind spot. However, the list of failures reads like a maintenance log that learned to shout, because what inspectors flagged was not one bad day, but patterns that accumulate in quiet corners. On the other hand, reports of residue at drains, buildup on equipment frames, and defects in infrastructure expose the same truth that every production veteran knows. Meanwhile, stainless steel is only as honest as the brush that scrubs it and the clock that times the pause before restart. But the most surprising thing is how cleanliness has a memory. Clean rooms were not clean enough. However, when contamination lives in the environment rather than a single batch, every cut becomes distribution, and the slicer stops being a tool and starts being a courier. On the other hand, deli counters thrive on rhythm, a blade passing over hundreds of servings with the casual grace of muscle memory that turns minutes into service. Meanwhile, that rhythm becomes amplification when the organism on the guard plate is patient and cold-loving, because this is listeria and not a germ that dies at the first chill. Even so, the case light is not a guarantee. Cold case, hot risk. However, the human toll anchors the facts in breath and names, because beyond the libraries of form sit families who planned lunches and landed in trauma. On the other hand, the count crosses into double digits for deaths, and the tally of hospitalizations climbs into dozens, reminding us that a percentage point in a report is a person who did everything right. Meanwhile, the severity clusters around pregnant women, older adults, and the immunocompromised, because immunity is a ladder and some rungs are missing. Even so, the message for the rest is not indifference, but vigilance. Statistics are families with names. However, the phrase federal inspection takeover sounds bureaucratic until you realize it means someone else now holds the keys to when a plant can run. On the other hand, reopening under tighter oversight is not a punishment ritual, but an engineering process where line speed, sanitation intervals, and environmental swabbing are recalibrated with fewer assumptions. Meanwhile, the culture shift is the real fix, because safety leadership is less about slogans and more about the power to stop a profitable line on a hunch. Even so, a hunch supported by data is policy. The code decides. However, that code is not just the rule book, but the microscopic report that rides with every lot, every establishment mark, and every time a test says proceed or pause. On the other hand, shoppers only see the logo, yet investigators chase the tiny EST number stamped on seams and end flaps to link a sandwich to a room, a date, and a shift. Meanwhile, the discipline you used with Boar's Head should be the habit you carry to any deli, because labels are less about marketing than traceability in an emergency. Even so, the instruction remains painfully small. The code decides. However, a single brand does not explain a nationwide reach, so now we follow the pipeline that feeds cafeterias and hospitals, where convenience is not luxury but necessity. On the other hand, Brucepack represents that institutional artery, shipping ready-to-eat meats by the case to school districts, healthcare systems, corporate dining, and big chains that standardize menus by the mile. Meanwhile, nearly 12 million pounds moved under that recall category, and the classification was not gentle, because Class 1 means there is a reasonable probability of serious harm. Even so, the definition is designed to cut through denial. Convenience cuts both ways. However, institutions face a special paradox because they serve populations least able to absorb a bad lunch, yet they rely most heavily on products meant to be opened and served. On the other hand, a hospital diet tray expects predictability, not drama, and a school cafeteria counts success in minutes, not slow roasts, and that is why ready-to-eat systems exist in the first place. Meanwhile, when the environment at a plant fails, the amplification factor multiplies across thousands of plates in a single day. Even so, the corrective is not fear, but redesign. One supplier, 1,000 cafeterias. However, the temptation is to assume that speed is the enemy, yet speed saves time and money for families as well as firms, so the adversary is unmanaged speed. On the other hand, the way we frame the McDonald's throughput paradox still applies here, because a system that pushes volume without pausing for uncertainty turns its strength into its weakness in a single shift. Meanwhile, the lesson is not anti-industry but pro-control, a discipline that inserts friction where error likes to hide. Even so, friction today prevents recall tomorrow. Bigger pipes, bigger floods. However, none of this matters if the consumer has no tools beyond headlines, so the next best habit is a weekly ritual that takes 2 minutes and costs nothing. On the other hand, the recall pages maintained by food safety agencies list affected UPCs, lot codes, and retail distribution by state, and those lists update as fast as investigators can type. Meanwhile, saving those pages in your phone bookmarks is not paranoia, it is literacy, the quiet kind that turns a grocery run into a checklist rather than a gamble. Even so, literacy is only useful if used. Bookmark before you buy. However, the final turn inside the plants is less dramatic but more decisive because it is about who can say no when the line begs for yes. On the other hand, the authority to slow a conveyor, to repeat a sanitation cycle, or to expand an environmental swab program is the kind of power that never trends but always protects. Meanwhile, companies that invest in that power spend money twice, once on prevention and once on skepticism, and both are cheaper than a recall measured in lives and millions of pounds. Even so, skepticism is a skill you can practice at home. Cold case, hot risk. However, the bridge from factories to family tables narrows when the label feels like a friend, which is why the next chapter follows familiar names through breakfast and beyond to show how comfort becomes exposure. On the other hand, we will start with turkey bacon that promised a healthier morning and move to meal kits that promised a fresher dinner, because promises are where oversight must be sharpest. Meanwhile, the through line will remain the same as before, a focus on codes, on cold, and on the many faces one plant can wear. Even so, the question is already on your counter. What is hiding in your routine? Part 3. Household names, bacon, meal kits, and the breakfast trap. However, the story shifts from factory doors to your kitchen clock because the first alarm rang over something that promises a lighter morning and a faster skillet. On the other hand, Oscar Mayer turkey bacon moved from comfort food to caution tape when 368,000 pounds were pulled back before breakfast could even crisp. Meanwhile, the notice said the sampling suggested listeria risk, and although no illnesses were confirmed at recall time, the math still pointed to probability, not rumor. Even so, habits matter more than headlines. Breakfast should never need a lab test. However, labels matter even more than habits, and this is where the quiet literacy we practice becomes muscle memory with numbers you can hold in your hand. On the other hand, the UPCs to check were 071871548748 and 071871548601, and the lots that mattered carried the marks 19 rupees, 40 rupees, and 42 rupees. Meanwhile, the use by window narrows the search, but the decisive detail is always the tiny establishment mark hiding by the seam. Even so, the rule stays unglamorous and absolute. The code decides what stays or goes. However, some viewers ask why react so hard before anyone is hurt, and the answer is that preventive recalls exist to keep a line from becoming a case count. On the other hand, acting early means you throw away $10 to avoid a hospital bill and a week of fear that spreads through the family chat one text at a time. Meanwhile, risk is not a wager against other people's outcomes when the mechanism is already plausible and the exposure is already real. Even so, certainty is not required for protection. Discard early, not after after headlines. However, routine can become a shield when companies test and regulators sample, yet routine can become a trap when we treat breakfast as autopilot. On the other hand, processed turkey bacon carries the halo of healthier choice, but still walks the same production floors and the same environmental risks that haunt any ready-to-eat line. Meanwhile, the difference between raw meat and a cured strip is not flavor, but control, because one demands your heat and the other depends on someone else's hygiene. Even so, the pathogen respects neither intention nor branding. Routines catch what habits often miss. However, comfort at night carried its own surprise when investigators traced a deadly cluster not to a grimy back alley, but to the bright refrigerator case labeled fresh and convenient. On the other hand, Fresh Realm chicken fettuccine Alfredo landed in carts under names you know like Market Side and Home Chef, and then landed in case files with numbers that refused to soften. Meanwhile, the count held steady at 17 confirmed cases across 13 states with 16 hospitalizations, 3 deaths, and 1 fetal loss that should change how we see a plastic clamshell. Even so, appearances do not sterilize reality. Fresh was a feeling, not a safeguard. Without subscribing, the next time you sit down at a chain restaurant, you'll have no idea what risks are riding on that fork. Subscribe today, or keep eating in the dark. However, the confusion deepened once shoppers realized the brand on the lid was not the name on the door at the plant, and that is where we repeat the lesson that stings. On the other hand, a single facility can feed a dozen labels in a dozen chains, which means one failure translates across banners as if the aisle had no dividers at all. Meanwhile, the establishment number is the real breadcrumb trail, and the lot range is the timeline that shows who bought what and when across a quiet national web. Even so, the phrase that organizes the chaos remains simple: one plant, many labels, many doorways. However, action still beats anxiety, and the home protocol is both simple and strict when exposure is even a possibility rather than a certainty. On the other hand, anything recalled leaves the house today, not tomorrow, and anything that touched it gets a hot wash, a bleach wipe, and a pause before reuse from the shelf groove to the crisper bin to the knife edge. Meanwhile, deli meats for high-risk people do not return to the plate cold because 165 degrees is a number that kills without debate or drama. Even so, a routine you repeat becomes protection you trust. Clean today to keep tomorrow ordinary. However, the danger with listeria is not only what it does, but when it chooses to do it, because the incubation window stretches patience and muddies memory. On the other hand, symptoms can take days or even weeks to surface, which is why timelines blur and why receipts and lot codes anchor reality when the body does not speak quickly. Meanwhile, fever aches, nausea, confusion, and in pregnancy, even a mild fever can mask a severe threat to the fetus, which is why low drama does not mean low risk. Even so, slowness is not mercy when the stakes are lives. A slow pathogen still outruns denial. However, a recall is not a one-way broadcast, but a puzzle you can solve with the paper and pixels you already own, and that shift turns fear into action. On the other hand, you pull receipts and scan barcodes against the published lists, then open the freezer and the second refrigerator in the garage where forgotten purchases go to hide. Meanwhile, you drop a picture of the label in the family group and ask who ate what and when, because memory needs prompts and households eat at different times. Even so, ordinary sleuthing becomes extraordinary safety. Be the investigator in your own kitchen. However, the hardest illusion to break is the faith that a familiar logo equals a single origin and a single standard. And here a soft echo from our Aldi deep dive earns its return. On the other hand, private labels thrive because one efficient plant can make many versions of the same meal at a price that wins the shelf in the search. Yet that same advantage multiplies the blast radius when the environment fails. Meanwhile, you read the establishment code and the lot sequence and the production date because the brand will not tell you the factory story by itself. Even so, the shortcut never changes. Brand names rotate plants rarely do. However, counting exposures across a day forces a blunt revelation because breakfast, lunch, and dinner can all involve ready-to-eat shortcuts that skip your stove entirely. On the other hand, turkey bacon in the morning, deli slices at noon, and a chilled meal at night create 3 rolls of the same dice if the pipeline stumbles upstream without anyone noticing until the numbers finally align. Meanwhile, national distribution means what touches one city on Monday can touch another on Friday, and call it routine shipping as the map fills with color. Even so, probability grows inside repetition, not panic. Routine multiplies risk faster than fear. However, the next turn in this story is not louder but sharper because 2 cases that might look small on a spreadsheet carry lessons too big to skip. On the other hand, a regional smokehouse taught us that one confirmed positive in 100 pounds matters because the principle matters, not the poundage. And a brand that carried a counterfeit inspection mark taught us that paperwork can be a costume. Meanwhile, those are not footnotes but flares, because process integrity and label truth are the only defenses you can verify from the outside. Even so, the smallest cracks reveal the structure. Small stories teach the biggest rules. However, before we step into those edge cases, ask yourself the question that changed how inspectors looked at a simple round stamp and a simple printed line. On the other hand, who certifies the stamp that certifies your dinner, and what happens when the seal itself is the lie that unlocks the shelf for everything behind it? Meanwhile, factories have addresses, and inspectors have names, and trucks have routes, and every one of those details will matter when we follow the paper through the door. Even so, the next answer bites harder than the question: what if the stamp was never real? Part 4. Edge cases with big lessons, regional sausage and fake stamps. However, the first edge case looks tiny on a spreadsheet, a mere 100 pounds against millions, yet that scale hides the point that matters most. On the other hand, Bourgeois Smokehouse Undoyle returned a confirmed positive for listeria in finished product, the kind of finding that ends debate and starts action. Meanwhile, the recall moved through Rouse's markets across Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi, where Undoyle is more comfort than commodity. Even so, comfort does not disinfect a label, small batch, real risk. However, regional foods carry a special gravity because they flow through tradition and trust is exactly what contamination exploits when vigilance loosens. On the other hand, a local brand feels close to home, and that closeness can mute the instinct to verify lot codes and establishment marks. Meanwhile, the organism does not care about zip codes or nostalgia, and it certainly does not care about family recipes when it reaches the gut. Even so, affection is not a safety system. Local favorites need scrutiny too. However, the lesson from this small recall is not panic, but procedure, because the household play is identical whether the volume is 100 pounds or 7 million. On the other hand, you check the code, you discard without ceremony, you clean the shelf groove and the cutting board, and you take a beat before restocking. Meanwhile, you store the habit, not the headline, so that the next alert triggers the same quiet choreography. Even so, repetition is the real shield. Ritual turns risk into routine. However, the second edge case is louder because the danger lived on the outside of the package, not the inside, and that is where fraud meets dinner. On the other hand, Olancho branded meats carried a mark that looked like federal approval, yet traced back to nowhere. A stamp that asked you to trust what never existed. Meanwhile, the counterfeit inspection number broke the chain of traceability that lets investigators link a bite to a room to a shift. Even so, a fake seal poisons the promise. No stamp, no trust. However, the inspection mark is not decoration, but the passport that connects a product to a plant, and the plant to an inspector, and the inspector to a record you can verify. On the other hand, the real mark begins with EST and points to a number that should resolve to a real facility with a real history of checks and corrective actions. Meanwhile, you can find that history in public bulletins that show dates, lots, and distribution down to the state. Even so, the habit is learned in seconds. Verify the mark before the meal. However, misbranding without a confirmed pathogen still commands a recall because the missing link is certainty, and certainty is the only currency that matters when safety is at stake. On the other hand, a chain of custody you cannot prove is a safety you cannot claim, and that truth pulls every package out of circulation until the story can be told in facts. Meanwhile, consumers rarely see the full investigation, but they do see the instruction on what to do today. Even so, uncertainty is a complete answer. When in doubt, remove and report. However, all 6 cases now converge into a playbook anyone can run at home without special tools, and the steps look almost too simple until you need them. On the other hand, read the establishment number and the lot code, compare them to the recall list, discard immediately, sanitize contact surfaces, and monitor symptoms with extra caution for pregnancy, age, or weakened immunity. Meanwhile, heat deli meats to 165 degrees for high-risk households because that number is a line between exposure and control. Even so, the shortest list saves the longest week. Check, discard, clean, confirm. However, a playbook needs a clock, and the clock here is weekly because recall pages update as fast as investigators can type, and yesterday's safe list is not tomorrow's. On the other hand, saving the FSIS and CDC recall hubs to your phone turns seconds into protection before a grocery run. Meanwhile, a 2-minute ritual on Sundays can keep Monday lunches from carrying Friday's headlines without anyone noticing. Even so, the smallest calendar block pays back big. Set alerts and keep receipts. However, the soft echo from our Aldi analysis returns because private labels depend on co-packing, and co-packing means the label you love might come from a plant you have never heard of. On the other hand, that is not an accusation against value brands. It is a reminder that the establishment mark is the identity card, while the front logo is the outfit of the day. Meanwhile, one facility can whisper across 10 banners in the same aisle, and one failure can shout across all of them at once. Even so, the refrain still organizes the noise. One plant, many labels. However, the callback to McDonald's matters for a different reason, because the throughput paradox is not just fast food, it is any system that prizes motion over questioning. On the other hand, speed is a gift when controlled, and a hazard when worshipped, and the difference is who can press pause without asking permission. Meanwhile, redesigning sanitation intervals, expanding environmental swabs, and empowering line stops costs money that headlines never thank, yet that invisible spend is the only thing between volume and vulnerability. Even so, efficiency must serve safety, not reverse it. Bigger pipes, bigger floods. However, the household version of empowerment looks like small tools that add up, and those tools are already in your pocket and your drawer. On the other hand, build a family group chat ritual for label photos, save receipts in one folder, keep a bottle of bleach and a roll of liners within reach of the crisper, and pin recall links next to your grocery list. Meanwhile, these microsystems turn a household into a checkpoint where risk slows down long enough to be seen. Even so, ordinary logistics save extraordinary days, make safety a shared habit. However, the quiet conclusion is not a sermon about fear, but a reminder that food safety is a chain of trust built from stamps, codes, and routines that anyone can learn. On the other hand, cold cases in stores can still carry hot risks at home, and the only way to reconcile that contradiction is to treat literacy as a kitchen tool as real as a thermometer. Meanwhile, the 6 meats we traced were not outliers, but examples that reveal how the system fails and how a shopper fights back. Even so, the rule that began our journey returns without drama. The code decides. However, the map you saw at the start now looks less like a storm and more like a set of controllable steps that interrupt exposure before it becomes tragedy. On the other hand, checking once is not enough because recalls expand, lot lists grow, and supply routes shift across days and weeks while the product in your fridge looks unchanged. Meanwhile, the discipline that keeps you safe is the discipline you barely notice. A minute on a website, a glance at a seam, a small decision made early rather than late. Even so, the final habit is the simplest of all. Make caution automatic today.